From around 1150, Christian Swedish kings decided that the Finns were having the wrong idea about religion, so they launched a series of holy invasions to fix that problem. By 1634, Sweden had conquered all of Finland and felt pretty successful about it. In February 1808, Russia invaded Sweden. The war ended in 1809, forcing Sweden to give up the Grand Duchy of Finland. Finland then became a territory ruled by the Russian Tsar, who promised laws, freedoms, and religious tolerance in exchange for complete loyalty. After the October Revolution of 1917, the Russian Empire and the Tsar collapsed spectacularly. On December 6, 1917, Finland declared independence and became a republic. Unfortunately, the brand new country immediately plunged into a civil war. From January 27th to May 15, 1918, the Finnish Civil War broke out between the Finnish White Guards, backed by Germany, and the Finnish Socialist Workers' Republic, supported by Soviet Russia. In the end, the Whites won. Tens of thousands of Social Democrats fell victim to the so-called White Terror, while the survivors either went underground, kept a very low profile, or left the country entirely. A few months later, these exiles regrouped in Moscow and founded the Communist Party of Finland. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland and kicked off World War II. At the time, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union technically had a secret agreement promising not to punch each other, but the Soviets, and Stalin in particular, didn't exactly trust a massive army that had just steamrolled half of Europe. This made things awkward for Finland. Thanks to Finland's rather close relationship with Germany during the war 20 years earlier, Soviet leaders worried that Finland might suddenly team up with Germany and attack them, even though Finland was completely neutral and busy minding its own business. Finland's border on the Karelian Isthmus, along with several small islands in the Gulf of Finland, was only 30 kilometers from Leningrad, well within artillery range. Stalin did not like it. So the Soviet Union made an offer. Finland would move its border back 20 kilometers and hand over those territories. In return, Finland would receive twice as much land in eastern Karelia, around Rebeli and Porosezero, land that was, unfortunately, almost impossible to live on. And Finland should also lease the port of Hanko so the Soviets could set up a naval and air base. On paper, it sounded fair. Finland would gain more land than it lost. But there was a tiny issue. A Soviet base at Hanko, right at Finland's front door, meant the Soviets could walk in and take the whole country whenever they felt like it. This wasn't just paranoia. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had accepted similar deals in September and October. They allowed Soviet military bases on their soil. By 1940, they had lost their independence entirely and were absorbed into the Soviet Union. Negotiations collapsed on November 13, 1939. Finland began full mobilization. Then, on November 28th, Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov unilaterally canceled the 1932 non-aggression pact with Finland. "Comrade, are you free tonight? After my guard duty, maybe we could take a walk around the village." "A walk? It's minus 30 degrees and the snow is up to my knees. Where exactly are we walking? To Siberia?" "Well, I just got a new winter coat. Very warm." "A government-issued coat? Then it's probably as warm as a promise from headquarters." "I can sing." "You sang last time. My chicken stopped laying eggs for 2 days." "So is there anything I can do to make you change your mind?" "I'll go with you if the sky falls, right now." The Soviet Union announced that Finnish artillery had fired 7 shells across the border, killing 4 Red Army soldiers and wounding 9 others. Finland denied everything and suggested an international investigation. The Soviet Union declined the offer and instead declared the incident an act of aggression, meaning the Soviets now had no choice but to defend themselves. 4 days later, the Winter War officially began. Nazi Germany couldn't help because of the Soviet-German pact. Britain and France had plans to help, but Norway and Sweden declared neutrality and politely refused to let British and French troops pass through their territory on the way to Finland. It turned out Finland would be fighting this war mostly by itself. The Soviet Union entered the war with almost 760,000 soldiers, over 6,600 tanks, 1,700 armored vehicles, and 3,800 aircraft. Finland, by comparison, had about 346,000 troops, 32 tanks, and 216 planes. On paper, this looked less like a war and more like a math problem with an obvious answer. However, the Red Army had one small issue. After Stalin's political purges in 1937, tens of thousands of officers had been executed, imprisoned, or removed from their posts, including many of the most experienced senior commanders. As a result, the Red Army had plenty of equipment, but not quite enough people who knew how to use it properly. Meanwhile, many Finnish commanders had served under the Tsar, in the German army during World War I, and in Finland's recent civil war. Experience was something they had plenty of. On November 30th, 1939, the Soviet Union launched a full-scale invasion of Finland, sending 23 divisions across the Finnish border. The Soviet Air Force immediately began heavy bombing raids on Finnish cities, including the capital, Helsinki, which received particularly intense attention from the sky. Finland's Air Force consisted of 84 fighters and dive bombers. Not exactly impressive, but Finnish pilots were well-trained and highly experienced, which helped balance things out. Despite being badly outnumbered, they fought effectively and managed to inflict meaningful losses on the Soviet Air Force. On the very first day of the war, 16 cities and towns in southern Finland were bombed. A major raid on Helsinki caused 327 casualties, most of them civilians, and destroyed large parts of the city. The Soviet strategy was clear: weaken Finland's ability to fight, spread panic among civilians, and pressure the Finnish government into surrendering as quickly as possible. The winter of 1939 to 1940 was one of the coldest in the 20th century, with temperatures dropping to -40 or even 50 degrees Celsius. The Soviet army entered Finland with overwhelming numbers, but winter had other plans. Short on proper winter gear, medical supplies, and efficient logistics, the Red Army soon discovered that surviving the cold was a challenge of its own. In fact, the freezing weather proved so brutal that some estimates suggest more soldiers were lost to the cold than to combat. Meanwhile, the Finnish soldiers, though heavily outnumbered, were far more comfortable in snowy forests and extreme temperatures. They knew the land, the weather, and how to move through it. Instead of confronting the Soviet forces head-on, the Finns pulled back strategically, drawing Soviet units deep into Finnish territory. Once the Red Army had advanced about 30 miles, Finnish forces counterattacked from forest positions, targeting flanks and supply lines day and night. Cut off from supplies, many Soviet units were forced to retreat with heavy losses. Throughout December, nearly 12 Soviet divisions launched repeated attacks against the Mannerheim Line on the Karelian Isthmus. None of them succeeded. Tanks frequently ran into mines, infantry got tangled in barbed wire, and Finnish machine gun positions hidden in the forests took full advantage of the situation. In Karelia, blizzards trapped Soviet units in wooden shelters where many soldiers froze to death. Vehicles slid into swamps or became stuck on frozen rivers, only to sink when the ice melted in spring. Long columns of abandoned trucks and tanks were left behind on narrow forest roads. At this point, the Red Army faced a long list of unexpected problems. Dark uniforms stood out clearly against the snow. Communication and movement through Finnish marshlands were slow and difficult. Supplying food, fuel, and warmth to more than 500,000 men in 40 degrees Celsius weather turned out to be far more complicated than anyone had planned. On the night of December 10, 1939, a Red Army battalion launched a surprise attack on Finnish positions near a village east of Ilomantsi. This should have been a perfect opportunity for the Soviets to exploit a weak point in Finnish defenses. However, the Red Army soldiers were exhausted and extremely hungry after fighting in freezing conditions with very limited food supplies. As they moved forward, they passed a Finnish field kitchen where sausages were being cooked. The rich smell of hot, fatty food, carefully prepared to keep soldiers energized in the winter, proved far more distracting than anyone expected. For a moment, the attack was forgotten. Hungry Soviet soldiers stopped, rushed into the camp, and began eating the Finnish sausages to fill their empty stomachs. While this was happening, Finnish forces were alerted, quietly surrounded the area, and launched a sudden counterattack on the unprepared guests. The clash that followed became one of the few recorded bayonet engagements of the Winter War. Although the sausage battle was short and small in scale, it clearly exposed weaknesses in the Red Army's planning, logistics, and discipline. The Finnish army later came up with a very simple but effective weapon known as the Molotov cocktail, a name chosen as a playful jab at Vyacheslav Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister. In practice, it was essentially a bottle filled with fuel, but it turned out to be extremely useful against Soviet light tanks, which were slow to maneuver and had relatively thin armor. Using this improvised weapon, Finnish forces managed to destroy an estimated 2,268 Soviet tanks during the war. Finland also had exceptionally skilled snipers. The most famous among them was Simo Häyhä, nicknamed the White Death by Soviet troops. Armed mainly with a bolt-action rifle and a Suomi KP-31 submachine gun, Häyhä alone was officially credited with 505 confirmed kills over the course of the conflict, making him one of the most effective snipers in military history. By February 1940, the Red Army decided it was time for a change in strategy. Instead of spreading out, they concentrated their forces and launched a massive assault on the Karelian Isthmus, supported by heavy air raids on railway stations and key transport hubs behind the Finnish lines. The plan was to overwhelm Finland with sheer numbers and end the war once and for all. After more than 3 months of intense fighting, many Finnish defensive lines were finally broken. With ammunition exhausted and supplies running dry, Finnish forces defending Koivisto were forced to withdraw. In May 1940, the Soviet Union landed 2 divisions at Petsamo, attacking a position held by just 3 Finnish companies. This breakthrough punched a hole in Finland's northern defenses. The 3 Finnish companies stationed there fought on until the very end and were ultimately wiped out to the last man. By this point, the Soviet Union was one of the world's major powers, with impressive political influence, military strength, and industrial development. They were quite confident and fully expected that defeating Finland would be a simple task. What they didn't expect was that Finland's supposedly modest army would manage to keep them busy for nearly 3 months. And keep them busy is putting it very politely. The Red Army suffered a number of painful setbacks in Finland that later became some of the most famous and often joked about moments in military history. On May 12, 1940, the Finnish government was forced to accept the Soviet Union's original terms, and both sides agreed to a ceasefire. After more than 3 months of combat, the war ended in a Soviet victory, though one that came at a very high cost. Finland suffered over 70,000 military casualties, including nearly 26,000 dead and more than 44,000 wounded, along with the loss of 30 tanks and 60 aircraft. Civilian losses from air raids amounted to around 2,800 casualties, and nearly 7,000 homes were destroyed or severely damaged. Meanwhile, despite initiating the war and ultimately prevailing, the Soviet Union's losses were far greater. The Red Army suffered approximately 381,000 casualties, including nearly 168,000 dead or missing, over 207,000 wounded, 6,000 captured, the destruction or damage of 3,500 tanks and armored vehicles, and the loss of around 500 aircraft. Although the Red Army emerged victorious, it failed to achieve its original objectives and suffered heavy losses along the way. As a result, the Soviet Union's standing on the international stage took a noticeable hit. Despite being far smaller and weaker on paper, Finland managed to hold off the Red Army far longer than anyone had expected and inflicted losses that were disproportionately high compared to its own. For Finland, this became a major moral victory, while for the Soviet military, it was a painful and very expensive lesson. The setbacks forced Joseph Stalin to seriously reassess the real capabilities of his armed forces. From that point on, he became far more cautious about the possibility of a future attack by Hitler. Meanwhile, the war brought Finland an unprecedented level of national unity, later remembered as the spirit of the Winter War. Finland's international reputation also grew significantly. According to Johan Nikop, a leading Finnish diplomat and a member of the delegation sent to Moscow in November 1939, The Winter War and the peace that followed ultimately saved Finland from disappearing entirely from the map of the world. That said, it's only fair to look at the bigger picture. The Winter War did, in its own indirect way, shape later events in World War II. It contributed to Germany underestimating Soviet strength, one of the factors that encouraged the German invasion of the Soviet Union. At the same time, it gave the Red Army valuable experience in fighting under extreme winter conditions and introduced new combat methods, even if many of them proved less effective against Germany's heavier tanks. Overall, the Winter War remains a victory with the consequences of a defeat for the Soviet Union, successful on paper, but costly in reputation, confidence, and long-term impact.